Well, I bring you greetings as one of the leading self-proclaimed anti-racist activists in the United States. I appreciate Chad and the folks at ISI putting this debate together, and for all of you coming out. I know it's a busy week. In terms of answering the question that's been put to us this evening, is affirmative action good for America? I want to be very clear about my position so as not to mislead anyone. While affirmative action is certainly not an end-all, be-all, it is certainly not sufficient if we are serious about creating racial equity in this country. I nonetheless am quite clear that it is an important mechanism, not sufficient, but nonetheless important for obtaining that goal. So I have very little trouble answering the question in the affirmative that affirmative action is indeed good for America, and it's good for the very same reason it was in the eyes of none other than Ronald Reagan, who I will tell you I have great pains to agree with on anything, but who in 1974, as an outgoing governor of the state of California, one of the very last acts that this man, who of course would change his mind on the road to the White House, one of the very last things that he would do in office in his waning weeks was to sign into law the very affirmative action programs, many of which were eliminated, at least in part with the help of the gentleman I'm debating this evening, when Proposition 209 was passed in that state in 1996. And when Reagan signed into law those policies, which we now derisively call racial preference so as to delegitimize them, this is what he said. This is not me. This is what Ronald Reagan said. He said, "Time and experience have shown that laws of non-discrimination are not enough. Justice demands that each and every citizen consciously adopt and accentuate a real and personal commitment to affirmative action so as to make equal opportunity a reality." What Reagan was suggesting, as hard as it is to believe now, in retrospect, knowing what we know about him ideologically, was that it was not enough to simply pass civil rights laws as we had done in the 1960s, imploring folks to treat everyone equally and to refrain from discrimination. He was suggesting that long entrenched patterns of discrimination against peoples of color and preferences and privileges and head starts for those of us who were white had created such an uneven playing field in this nation that conscious efforts, deliberate efforts at inclusion had to be made. And Reagan was right in 1974. And again, it pains me to say the words Reagan was right. But it was true, and the logic of that day still holds, as I'll demonstrate in just a few seconds. Affirmative action is ultimately good for America because it is one of the, again, not the only one, and probably not the most important one, but one of the principal mechanisms for balancing out and ultimately nullifying institutionalized white racial preference and privilege in the American job market, the educational system, and contracting. In other words, affirmative action is an important mechanism for obtaining or coming closer to a true equal opportunity society, not merely in word, but in deed. In its absence, white racial preference and privilege will remain untouched and entrenched and would in fact be strengthened. The choice, and this is important, the choice in this country is not, as Ward Connerly may have you believe, between a society where there is affirmative action preference for people of color on the one hand, or on the other hand, a society where all are treated equally. That is not the choice. It is a choice between a society where racial preferences for whites remain in place, unchallenged and unmoderated by the countervailing force of affirmative action for people of color on the one hand, or a society where those white racial preferences, systemic and institutionalized as they are and have always been, will in fact be balanced and challenged by those efforts. In other words, to end affirmative action is not to end racial preference. It will only end the programs that seek to minimize such preferences as they operate each and every day in the lives of whites in this country, myself very much included. Because you see, however much Mr. Connerly may not wish to acknowledge it, and however much America on the whole may not wish to acknowledge it, the history of this country is the history of racial preference for my people, beginning at least as early as, if not before, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which you should know but probably don't because no one ever taught you this before in all likelihood, was the very first law that the Congress of the United States passed after the ratification of the Constitution. Before they did anything else, the first order of business was to pass a Naturalization Act which said that all free white folk and only free white folk could be citizens of the United States, an act of affirmative action and racial preference, though we strangely never call it that.
Fast forward 70 years or so to the 1860s and the passage of the Homestead Act, which allowed whites and virtually only whites to claim 270 million acres of land, most of it west of the Mississippi, 160 acres of family for $10 down, but black and brown folk couldn't get it, and of course it was brown folk land got jacked in the first place. 270 million acres, and there are 70 million white folk today as I speak living on that land that their families would never have had but for an act of white racial preference. But we don't talk about it like that, and we don't talk about the FHA and the VA loan programs for housing begun in the 1930s as being white racial preference. But now for the first 30 years of those programs, the only folks getting in on that government subsidized, government guaranteed, government provided housing, which in fact was the linchpin of the building of the white middle class in this country, were white folks. People of color could not get in on it. For the first 30 years, those benefits were almost exclusively for whites. $120 billion in housing equity loaned preferentially to white families, 35 million of them. And yet I tell you, my family got everything based on hard work. Nobody ever gave us anything because of the color of our skin. Yeah, nothing except that house, and nothing except that land, and nothing except that job you got with the GI Bill, which was supposed to be for all GIs, but it didn't really go down like that in practice. Those are all policies that if we believed in honest language in this country, but we do not, we would call affirmative action and racial preference. And if it was benefiting black folk, we'd have called it welfare. But because it benefited white people, we call it good macroeconomic policy. And we just leave well enough alone, you see. And as a result of those and other policies, the average white family in this country, I don't mean the average wealthy white family, I mean the average white family in the United States has 11 times the net worth of the average African-American family, 8 times the average net worth of the typical Latino family. Got nothing to do with harder work, better values, better culture, better DNA, or any of that. It has to do with systematic preference, and none of that is going to go away if you abolish affirmative action. If anything, it will become worse. Now, perhaps you believe that all that's in the past, and we should focus on the present. Fine. Aside from how utterly convenient it is to shrug off the effects of past injustice on the modern day racial realities, the fact is that that systematized white racial preference continues today. And this is a very important point because even Ward Connerly is on record as saying, so long as discrimination was rampant, affirmative action was indeed needed. August 10th, 1994, the man I am debating this evening testifies to the Judiciary Committee of the California State Assembly, and he says, quote, "There was a time when affirmative action had value. There was discrimination and we needed some sort of shock treatment. The time has come to take off the training wheels," end of quote. Now understand what this means and why I have quoted him this evening. It means that Mr. Connerly cannot claim this evening to oppose race-conscious efforts like affirmative action on principle, because he is on record as admitting that as long as racial discrimination is rampant against folks of color, the programs are needed, which means, my friends, the only issue before us tonight, the only one, is whether systemic discrimination still indeed exists against folks of color. If it does, and don't you just know I'm about to prove it, then his own words suggest that the debate is over and affirmative action is both necessary and good. So what is the truth today? Not 30 years ago, not 50 years ago, but right about now. Well, for one, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, that's the agency charged with monitoring compliance with affirmative action and civil rights law more broadly, has reported that upwards of 75% of all companies covered by equal opportunity requirements, not just affirmative action now, but even the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that 3 out of 4 of those companies covered by the law are in substantial violation of the law because of ongoing patterns of discrimination, not against white people, but against folks of color. The problem is that our government does not prioritize civil rights enforcement and never has done so, be it run by Democrats or Republicans. And so the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs only has about 4,000 monitors on their payroll whose job it is to check up and see if folks are following the law. That is so few that it's only enough to check up on each company once every 46 years and determine whether or not they're in compliance. There's literally no deterrent then to prevent that kind of discrimination. As such, discrimination against people of color continues unabated, whether we wish to see it or not. Moving on, 3 years ago, a study from MIT and the University of Chicago, both of their econ departments, found that job applicants with white-sounding names, 50% more likely to get a call back for a job interview for an actual job than folk with black-sounding names, even when all relevant qualifications, merit indicators are indistinguishable from one another. Important for two reasons. Number one, it suggests a pattern of ongoing discrimination against folk of color, and it disproves quite mightily this notion of reverse discrimination, because if indeed it was white folks that couldn't catch a break in the labor market, and if indeed it paid to be black, this study would have been the one to prove it. Man, you could just sort of put yourself in the place of the personnel director, and you come into the job on Monday and you open up your mail and you see the resume and you say, well, hot damn, Tamika has applied for the job. Oh, I must hire her. What'd you say, Jamal applied? Hell yes, get Jamal in here. But now, Mindy, no. Skylar, Jenny, I'm being sarcastic to make a point. This study demonstrated the pattern of discrimination is the same as it ever was. 1 year later, a study out of Milwaukee finds that white men with a criminal record slightly more likely to get a call back than black men without one, even when all the relevant qualifications, demeanor, dress, communication style, and everything related to merit are indistinguishable. Even worse, according to the National Center for Career Strategies, the vast majority, over 80% of all jobs in this country, are never openly advertised. Instead, they are filled by word of mouth through networks, and those tend to be largely race and gender exclusive in terms of who knows who lives around whom, who belongs to certain organizations and who does not, so that even if folk of color are the most qualified for something, there's a very good chance in this country that they will be scratched from the beginning of the race, so to speak, because they won't even know about the job availability because they are not in those networks. We know that this is one of the key reasons that 91% of all federal, state, and local contract dollars, even with affirmative action in place, still those dollars, 91 out of 100 of them received by white male-owned businesses, not because they are better, not because they do better work, not because they submit lower bids. Hell, white companies been jacking the government using low bids and then charging 5 times as much when the bill really comes due. Think Halliburton, think pretty much any company you want to think of for years, and they keep getting contracts. So it isn't about the bid, it isn't about competitiveness, it isn't about the quality of the work, it is about networks, knowing certain people, giving subcontracts to certain people, and those have a racial impact, even if it's not intended. Even if the contractors themselves are not overtly biased, you end up with a highly inequitable result. And none of this would end if affirmative action for people of color ended. If anything, it would become worse. We also have white racial preference in education, which won't be touched. But we heard a lot about the racial preferences for people of color at places like the University of Michigan because they gave 20 points to folks of color. We didn't talk about the fact that if you're from the Upper Peninsula, you got 16 points. I don't know if you've been there. The snow is not the only thing white in the Upper Peninsula of the state of Michigan, so when you give a preference on that basis, it ends up being racial. 4 points for the children of alumni, 92% of whom or more are white. If you went to one of the top schools in Michigan, you got 10 extra points, but who are the folks that went to those schools? Disproportionately white and affluent. If you had an AP curriculum throughout your junior and senior year, you got 8 extra points, which seems fair on face, but it's not, because the schools that serve mostly white students, not only in Michigan but around the country, have 3 times as many AP and honors courses offered per capita as the schools that serve students of color. All of that is what I mean when I say systematized white racial preference. Just because it isn't blatant, just because it doesn't call itself that, doesn't mean it's not that. It's like folks that get bent out of shape about Black History Month, because there isn't a White History Month, but of course there is. It just goes by the tricky name of May and June and July and August and September. Folks might say, well, that's all true, but affirmative action lowers merit standards, and that's untrue as well. In the job market, we know, for example, that 200 studies have been done on this topic, and a meta-analysis, fancy language for a study of other people's studies, was published in the Journal of Economic Literature several years ago, publication of the American Economics Association, finding that those persons who have benefited from affirmative action perform equal to or better than their white male counterparts once they are given the opportunity to prove themselves. And in terms of education, we know that the SAT and the LSAT, the MCAT, the GRE are pathetically correlated with overall college performance. At most, they can explain 17% of the difference in the first year after you take the test. No correlation beyond that. In the state of California, where Mr. Connerly is from, there is no correlation at Berkeley or UCLA between your test score and your graduation rates above and beyond grades. And so really what we're talking about is reconceptualizing merit and realizing that at the end of the day, the standards we use are neither fair nor equitable, and that affirmative action is an important, though not a complete, tool for eradicating racial inequity and starting that discussion about what are the proper merit standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wise. I would just ask the audience to hold your applause until the end of the debate. Mr. Connerly will now deliver his opening negative response.
Good evening. I am delighted to be among you. When Mr. Wise comes out of his shell, he's going to be all right. I wish life were as simple as he makes it appear. Blacks on one side and whites on the other, people of color, as he says. And he conveniently glosses over the term affirmative action without ever really saying what he means by that. Throughout my involvement in this issue, it has not been to dismantle, quote, affirmative action. It has been to dismantle those policies that government practices which treat people differently on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order, 10925, that for the first time uttered the words affirmative action. And that executive order commanded all federal agencies and those doing business with the federal government to take, quote, affirmative action to ensure that no one would be discriminated against when doing business with the federal government on the basis of those prohibited factors of race, color, and the like. After his assassination, the Congress ratified what President Kennedy had put into place in his executive order in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And that act guarantees you and I and everyone in this room the right to equal treatment, quote, without regard to race or color. Now, it's awfully seductive for someone to say that our society is racist at its core and that we have to use these tools, to use the common coin of the currency in this debate, to mitigate against that institutional racism. But as a nation, we're supposed to have certain ideals. We're supposed to practice those ideals. We have certain laws. We have a certain culture that prizes the concept of fairness. We're not always fair, but when we invoke that principle of fairness, generally we can get people to do what is right based on that principle of fairness. One cannot argue logically the position that Mr. Wise takes. You cannot argue that people should be treated differently on the basis of race. Regardless of the construct that he makes, you cannot get from here to there by saying that there are different classes of American citizenship, and some of us are entitled to one form of treatment, and others are entitled to a different form of treatment. Some of you may not be familiar with Proposition 209 that passed in California by a margin of 55 to 45. Let me share the language with you. Quote, The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. That's it. That's the language that Mr. Wise finds so objectionable. Nowhere in there are the words affirmative action mentioned. Not because we're trying to be cute about it or to deceive anybody, because we think that words matter. Affirmative action means different things to different people. What I'm opposed to is that form of affirmative action that treats people differently. Different standards, extra points, whatever involves treating people differently by a government agency, I'm opposed to. Now, I'm in support of affirmative action if it means socioeconomic conditions. I supported, as a UC regent, comprehensive review, which was selecting those students who went to schools that did not have the honors courses, for example, or schools that had a history of underperformance. I support that form of affirmative action because I found that the University of California never sent outreach people to those schools. They did not have honors courses, therefore they could not get the 4.2 and the 4.4 to make them competitive for admission to Berkeley or UCLA or UC Santa Barbara or UC San Diego. I supported affirmative action when it meant giving a break of sorts to a student who had never had a parent go to college. I oppose unalterably treating people differently on the basis of those prohibited factors of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment, public education, public contracting. If we're going to have a system in which we do have this two-tiered citizenship, as Mr. Wise would have you want, one for whites and one for people of color, how long? How long do we do that? How do we expect to have a civilized society without people being at each other's throats in that kind of a society? What is it saying about people like me for Mr. Wise to patronizingly suggest that we cannot compete? How long are we to be consigned to this presumption of our inadequacy? Anyone who presumes my inadequacy is not a friend of mine, no matter how great it might sound. You're not my friend. You're not my kid's friend. If you give them candy as the dentist, I want you to give the tough love. I want you to say it's a tough world. And you cannot compete in that world unless you go to high school, you graduate, you apply yourself, and then you're treated equally by every level of government. If there is discrimination, we all have a duty, I think, to ferret it out, to do what we can to get rid of it. But we don't say, we're going to give wholesale affirmative action, meaning different standards to people on the basis of race. Those who favor that, you have a duty to tell people how long you want to do that. Because I think that the patience of the American people is coming to an end with this form of affirmative action. Yesterday, the Supreme Court took up two cases which involve the use of race in student placement in K through 12. Next spring, I submit to you with every belief that I can muster that the court is going to strike it down. With that, we will begin to see the end of an era, the end of government being able to use race to move people around on the matrix of life based on this, I would say, perverse theory of those like Mr. Wise. We're going to have to find other ways to help those who need help, find other ways to provide access to those who are locked out. I want to do it on the basis of socioeconomic conditions, not on the basis of race or skin color. I believe that there is more within the body politic to support that than there is on the basis of race. Less than a month ago, the people of Michigan, a blue state, a Democrat governor, Democrat U.S. senators, voted 58 to 42 to end preferential treatment on the basis of those prohibited factors. I think that's a harbinger of things to come, folks. It's saying that the American people have lost their patience with the use of race as a way of solving social problems. And for those of us who want to solve social problems, it is incumbent upon us to find acceptable means, acceptable to the American people, for solving those problems. I think that there is a consensus around the use of socioeconomic factors. I urge that the University of Michigan get rid of legacy admits, as we did at the University of California. I didn't hear Mr. Wise weigh in on that. I've supported the comprehensive review. There's silence on the other end of the table for that approach. Why? Why do we support an outmoded concept that never really did enjoy major support among American people? Why can't we find a consensus among us for those things that people will embrace? They want to help those who need the help. It is not the same as saying they want to help black people because they presume that we all need the help. We all don't. So I think it's time for us to fashion solutions that are based on the right thing, the law, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and those things that people find to be fair. Thank you.
Mr. Wise has 5 minutes.
Well, let me just suggest that if we wait around for what's acceptable to the American people, which I guess, given who the majority of the American people are, means what's acceptable to white folk, we would never have had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because the majority of white folks didn't support it. In fact, at the time it was passed, 2/3 of white Americans said that Dr. King and the movement were asking for too much, too fast. See, white folk will tell you now they marched with Dr. King, but not so much. 2/3 of white folks in 1964 said the Civil Rights Act should be enforced voluntarily and we should just trust employers to do the right thing. So pardon me if I'm not prepared to wait around for what the majority thinks is a really good idea, because the majority thought segregation was a great idea. The majority thought that slavery was a fine idea, that killing indigenous folks was fine, stealing half of Mexico was fine. The majority's always been pretty cool with that, so I'm not really concerned about what the majority thinks. Now, I've always found it interesting when Ward Connerly and others say that people like me are being patronizing to folk of color because we're implying they can't make it without affirmative action. He knows full well that's not what's being implied. He knows full well that the implication is simply that no matter how hard one works, no matter how talented one is, racism actually matters. Discrimination actually has an effect. Certainly we know that to be true. There were plenty of folks who worked real hard in the early part of the 1900s, but it was Madam C.J. Walker who became the first black millionaire in 1911. Didn't mean everybody could have done it.
right? Because there were 62 black folk got lynched that year. So it wasn't a real good year for black people. But this one woman got rich. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have had the struggle for equity that folks were fighting at that time. I also find it interesting to have someone like Mr. Connerly say that it's patronizing and that it implies black people are somehow less capable, considering that he personally has received over the years nearly $1 million worth of funding from the Bradley Foundation. This is the same organization that paid Charles Murray $120,000 to write a little book you may have heard of called The Bell Curve, which actually says explicitly that black people are genetically inferior to white people. That's what the Bradley Foundation funded, and they've also given money to Mr. So here's a book that says black people are inferior, and he's sweating me because he thinks I'm implying it. A little bit of a contradiction. I would also suggest the argument's fundamentally racist, because since the vast majority of black and brown folks support affirmative action, to suggest that it insults their intelligence is to suggest that black people are too stupid to realize they're being insulted, which is a fundamentally racist argument. So it seems to me that argument has very little weight. He says we shouldn't have different standards for different people, and I fundamentally agree. You might be surprised, but I would suggest that without affirmative action, we have different and higher standards for people of color. Here's what I mean. If you have groups of people who, through no fault of their own, had started out in, let's say, an 8-leg relay race, if we just analogized American society to that, 3 laps behind other folks, and you still say, you got to have the same SAT score, we expect you to meet this exact same number in order to get in, or else you're not qualified. What you're actually saying is, you've got to run faster, you've got to be better, you've got to actually be smarter. So in fact, it is the opponents of affirmative action so-called preferences who would actually cement into place differential standards, asking the person who starts out 2 and 3 laps behind to hit the tape at the same time or earlier. I would suggest that if someone starts out 3 laps behind and finishes 1 lap behind and has closed the gap in terms of their performance, that's the faster runner. That's the one I want on my team, not the one who hit the tape first because he had a head start. I got news for you. If you've had more opportunity than me, you're supposed to have a better resume than me. If you've had more opportunity than me, you're supposed to get a better score than me. That's what comes with the advantage. That's what advantage is. But are we going to reward people on the basis of the head start over which they had no merit in terms of earning it? Are we going to punish folk who through no fault of their own started behind? Now, Ward Connerly makes a very good argument about socioeconomic affirmative action. It's not, by the way, one I disagree with. The only question is it an either-or proposition? It is certainly a good idea to have socioeconomic affirmative action, but let us remember that economic obstacles are not the only ones faced by people of color. There are people of color, I'll just take this city as an example. Middle class and above black folks with $50,000 a year or more in annual income. These are not poor folks. Just as likely to live in racially segregated high poverty communities as black folks with $2,500 a year in annual income, in part because of ongoing housing discrimination in this and other communities. So if all we do is look at the socioeconomics, we might say those families face no barriers, and that would be untrue. We need both economic and race-based affirmative action. Thank you.
If you want to fashion policies that solve social problems, you cannot be disdainful of the majority. It is foolish to be so. The majority is what dictates policy. The majority of the Congress that passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, those racists, were white. That was the majority that we had to rely upon. They can be prevailed upon to do the right thing. Black people, we're not the only ones who hold the franchise to being oppressed. We have to rely on the instinct to be fair of people. If we don't believe in that, then the whole democratic process fails. It crumbles. The Congress, I remind you, was white that passed the 64 Civil Rights Act. Yes, the Congress had to be urged by Dr. King and others to do what was the right thing. But Dr. King did rely on that judgment of people to be fair. And he said, you must live out the true meaning of your creed. The nation responded. And so I appeal to you to not embrace that notion that because they're white, they can't be fair, can't be trusted. And we're always going to be up against a majority that won't do the right thing. 42% of the people who voted in favor of keeping preferential treatment. And by the way, those were the words that Sandra Day O'Connor used, race preferences, when she cast her 5-4 vote in favor of the University of Michigan. So it's not just my term. The term race preferences has meaning to those who are involved in this issue. And the Congress decided to go with that policy of treating everyone equally without regard to race. And I renew my assertion that in order for us to be a society that remains true to what we believe in, we profess to believe in, we have to be true to that policy of treating everyone as an equal. I don't see how we as a society can survive with people expecting and getting different classes of citizenship. Statistics don't matter in this debate. Statistics don't matter. The whole idea of history 40 years ago or 100 years ago doesn't matter. Because the court has said, we're not here to cure societal ills. The only rationale for using race is the pursuit of diversity. And I submit to you that is on very, very tenuous grounds. And so, as we begin to look forward to what kind of a policy paradigm we're going to have with regard to this very contentious issue of affirmative action or race preferences, you have to rely on the majority, because in state after state, the people are striking down preferences. You have to trust the instincts of people to be fair, because people who are in the Congress, whether we like it or not, are largely white. And we have to believe that they're capable of doing the right thing for our system of government to survive. We have to find something other than race if we want to expand access to people who are now locked out of the system. And I submit socioeconomic conditions are the way to go. Thank you.
I don't know if you caught it, but something that Mr. Connerly said actually completely obliterates the fundamental premise of his entire argument. He says on the one hand that the Civil Rights Act, and he's been talking about it all evening, was an important piece of legislation, that the Congress did the right thing, though he acknowledges they had to be dragged kicking and screaming, many of them, to do it. What's interesting about that is he then says we have to rely on the good instincts of the majority, but by definition, if we had been able to rely on the good instincts of the majority, we would never have needed a Civil Rights Act. The debate is over. We would not have needed a Voting Rights Act. We would not have needed a Fair Housing Act. By definition, laws get passed because we don't trust that people will do the right thing. That's why we have laws against murder, because folks kill. That's why we have laws against theft, because people steal. The reason we pass laws is because we don't leave it up to chance. And even he believes that. I quoted him from 1994, and he did not take the chance to repudiate his former position, so I assume he still holds to it. And that position was, and you heard it before, that as long as there's rampant discrimination, affirmative action did have a purpose. He wants to say it's about principle. He wants to say it's about a principled opposition to treating people differently, but even he has said and is on record as saying in front of the California State Assembly that different standards, in fact, and different treatment can be done and should be done when there is evidence of profound discrimination. So then when he says stats don't matter, he's being intellectually disingenuous, because he's saying that in the past, when it was going down badly, even by his admission for folk of color, that affirmative action was fine. Like I told you, the only issue now is whether or not things have fundamentally changed. He would like you to believe it has. He has presented not one iota of information to suggest that it has. The only person who has presented any evidence at all, which I thought mattered in the context of an academic debate at a college where history and statistics and facts are sort of the point, has been me. Doesn't mean that I'm right, but it does mean that the standards for intellectual discourse are being set on one and not the other side. He says that Dr. King relied on the majority, but of course he didn't, because the majority didn't support him, and he knew it. In fact, he was very clear in both the letter from the Birmingham jail and in later writings that he believed the majority of white folks were not on board the fight for racial equity, but it didn't stop him. And since we brought up Dr. King, I think it is incumbent upon me to say, as a preemption to what I fear may come in the closing statement. He's been very good about not saying it yet, because he said it several years ago, sort of got his hand slapped for it. So, Ward Connerly used to go around saying Dr. King would have been opposed to these policies because he believed we should be treated on the content of our character and not the color of our skin and all of that. It's always funny how folks, I'm not talking about Mr. Connerly, he's considerably deeper than that, but a lot of folks will say that as if they only heard one line from one speech that Dr. King ever gave. This man was a preacher. He spoke at least every Sunday. But some folks have only heard this one line out of context. Because see, the very same year that Dr. King gave that talk in Washington, he also wrote a book called Why We Can't Wait. In fact, he'd finished the book before the march. And in that book, he said, and he was very unambiguous about it, he said, whenever this issue of preferential or compensatory treatment is raised, some of our friends recoil in horror. The Negro should be granted equality, they insist, but should ask for nothing more. While at first this seems reasonable, in fact, it is unrealistic, for it is obvious that if you take a man and put him at the starting line of a race 300 years after another man, the first man would have to perform some incredible feat in order to catch up. Now, it doesn't mean that Dr. King was right, or that I, because I support his view, am right, and that Ward Connerly is wrong. Just because King said it doesn't make it gospel, but it does mean that we have to look at history honestly and not hijack the movement in the name of so-called fairness, when the movement and its principal leader, or one of them, was very clear about what justice did and did not demand. It isn't about disdaining the majority. It is about realizing that the majority can't, in fact, be trusted to always do the right thing vis-a-vis minorities numerically or in terms of power. That's why we have a Bill of Rights. That's why we have a Constitution. That's why we had to have an abolition movement and a civil rights movement and all the laws that both Mr. Connerly and I support. It isn't about disrespecting the majority. It is about realizing that even the best intended people oftentimes do not do what is needed to uproot structures of injustice. Thank you very much.
Coming out of Jim Crow, yes, affirmative action made sense. But things are profoundly different today. Things are profoundly different today. James Meredith was the only one who could go to the University of Mississippi. Doors were locked tight against black people. You cannot, with a straight face, say that circumstances are the same today. Affirmative action was different then. It was designed to make sure that there was no discrimination against people because of their race or their skin color. That made sense. So the next time you go someplace, you can quote that I said here tonight. That made sense. But circumstances have changed profoundly during those years. We are on the threshold of a totally new paradigm with regard to race. The court is going to make a change. If we want to provide access to people who are now locked out, we're going to have to find other means of doing it. Mr. Wise can argue until the cows come home about what he says that I said 20 years ago or 10 years ago. But if we stand around still arguing this notion of race-based affirmative action, we're not serving the people of this country very well. We have to find new ways of helping those who are trapped in the inner city, who are trapped in rural areas, who are locked out of college opportunities, regardless of their race, regardless of their skin color. Race-neutral ways will have to be fashioned. We need to eliminate legacies. There is no rationale for a public agency giving the ancestors of someone a preference, regardless of whether they're white or black. There is every rationale for us to design an affirmative action program that helps people who are low income, who've never had parents go to college, who go to schools that do not provide the same opportunities as other schools, to equalize those schools, to equalize the opportunities. It doesn't make any sense for us to be slinging arrows at each other on the basis of what I said and what he said. The solution, it seems to me, is for us to recognize that times are changing. There is about to be an end to race-based affirmative action. By popular will, at the ballot box, and by the courts. What are we to do? Find an alternative. One that the majority of people can embrace. They will embrace socioeconomic. So I would urge us to do that. Thank you.
We'll now have our closing statements. I would ask the audience to start preparing their questions. And we'll have a 25 or 30-minute question and answer session after the close of the closing statements. Mr. Wise, your closing statement.
Mr. Connerly would suggest to you that it is somehow a principled position to dismantle policies which treat people different on the basis of race. And in theory, that may be a perfectly legitimate position. But if people have been treated differently on the basis of race for centuries, and that treatment continues today, albeit not in exactly the same fashion as under Jim Crow, which of course I never suggested, and if that different treatment has had an effect, a profound one, on the distribution of opportunities and resources, and it has, and the only evidence today suggests that it has, then to not seek remedies that target opportunities specifically to those who indeed have been injured and continue to be injured on the basis of race, irrespective of class, though class is also an issue, is to ensure the perpetuation of that entrenched racial inequality. If it's not going to be affirmative action, and he may well be right about what the court is inclined to do, thanks to his efforts and the efforts of others on his side of the aisle, he may indeed get his wishes. If not affirmative action, then his responsibility is to suggest what can replace it that can close the racial gaps, because it is the racial gap that has been created by the history about which we've spoken. And socioeconomic affirmative action, though a very good idea, cannot by definition close the racial gap, because the racial gap is both perpetuated and instrumentalized on the basis of racial discrimination, both past and present, not merely economic. For example, most of the people who say they support economic affirmative action, Dick Kallenberg and others that have written books about it, who are not necessarily wrong. The problem is their interpretation of economic status is so limited that it would in fact guarantee that thousands of people of color who were not poor but who indeed faced obstacles would be overlooked, because it usually amounts to looking at your income, the occupational status of your parents, and the educational status of your parents. But the problem with that is that we do have a lot of black and Latino families in the country making good incomes. Income disparity has diminished. That's a good thing that has happened in the last 30 and 40 years. But the wealth disparities, the disparities in assets, and assets are key to financing college educations. We know that really it isn't your income that you use to pay for your kids to go to school. It's the equity in your house. It's the savings that you have. And remember what I said at the outset, the average white family, 11 to 12 times the net worth, the assets minus debts of the average black family, 8 to 10 times the average for Latinos, which means that if we're going to use an economic standard, either as an addition to race or as a supplement, let me caution you, do not fall into the trap of only looking at income, because that will then essentially look at black folks who make good money, have good jobs, and say, well, you don't face any real obstacles anymore. Not realizing that relative to white families, who indeed have a huge head start in terms of assets, wealth, and net worth, that in fact that disparity is still quite profound. So if we're going to do what Mr. Connerly says, either as a supplement, which I would support, or as an alternative, which he would support, we got to be very careful, because socioeconomic status isn't just about your paycheck, and it isn't just about the kind of job that you have. It is about assets. If we want to have an asset test, try to get that pushed through at most schools. Try to get families, white, black, or otherwise, to really want to come clean about all the stuff they own. Good luck. It's going to be very difficult to do, to actually track down what folks' assets are. So it's not that it's a bad idea. It's just that it doesn't take into consideration the profound inequalities that go beyond what we typically think of as socioeconomic status. Look, at the end of the day, it's very simple. We're here to debate a principle: is affirmative action good for America? Whether or not affirmative action is going to be eliminated, that's a debate about principle. I have suggested to you that indeed affirmative action is good for one very simple and overriding reason. It is, although an imperfect mechanism, and I don't know a single person who supports it that thinks it is a perfect or complete mechanism. Certainly I do not. But it is the only one articulated up into this point that can begin to diminish the institutionalized white racial preferences that have been entrenched in this country for hundreds of years, unless you have a very clear example of what the other side would do to eliminate entrenched white racial preference, which is the default position of our society. Then the answer to the question put before us tonight, irrespective of what the court may or may not do, is yes, that affirmative action is good for America because it is good for the creation of equality. Thank you very much for coming out.
He's right about one thing. This is about principle. He's absolutely right about that. And there's one principle that's unassailable, and that is, should the government treat its citizens differently on the basis of race? The answer is no. No. The government has a duty to treat you and I as equals. It had that duty in the 1960s. Before then, it didn't always do it. People like me didn't always treat us equally. And I don't have to go through all the things that the government did that were wrong to my ancestors. But I know one thing: it doesn't have to do it to me, and I should not countenance it doing it to anybody else. That's the lesson that we should have learned from it. Civil rights are for everybody. Black, white, purple, green, you name it. Civil rights belong to everybody. And if this is about an ideal, if this is about a principle, as Mr. Wise so eloquently says, then let's live out the meaning of that ideal. And that is that every American citizen is entitled to the equal treatment before the law. You can't fudge that. You just can't fudge it. We can argue, and we should argue, about a lot of things. But there's one thing we should not argue about, and that's our right to be treated equally by our government. We can't opt out of it. April 15th, they're going to come looking for us if we don't send in that envelope with some money in it. We don't have any choice about whether we belong to the government or not. Therefore, it has a duty to treat all of us as equals. And if we see discrimination, we ought to say, it's wrong, and insist that it be changed, regardless of people's skin color, regardless of their race, whatever that means, regardless of their religion, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of any of that. We're all one extended human family in this country. And there's one thing we should expect from our government, and that's to be treated as an equal. The moment that we say we don't expect that, and we won't demand that, then the door is wide open for the government to do anything it darn well wants to do. Treat us any way that they want. Go back to the 60s. Find a different group to mistreat. The ideal, the principle of equal treatment before the law ought to be sacred to all of us. because that's the glue around which we build this American democracy. You take that away, and there are no holds barred for anybody. Any government official has the right to do whatever they want to do to level the playing field in their own eyes. It's not the kind of society that we want. We want everybody to be treated equally by their government. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, so I would ask those that have questions, please gather on the center mic here in the front of the aisle. I would also ask that you preface your question directed towards a particular debater. If it's to both of them, please let them know. Each debater will have about 2 minutes to respond to the question and a 1-minute rebuttal from the opponent if so desired. Sir, please.
I have a quick question and a follow-up question. The quick question, you can respond in 1 word. So,
This is the question.
Do you agree that hold on, okay, so that if you only look at like the economics of the situation, like income, that you are leaving out like the wealth disparity, for example, if you only look at socioeconomic like qualities of a family, are you leaving people out? Is that doesn't conquer the racial aspect of the situation?
Well, there are 2 parts, I think, to your question. Number one, I do favor an asset test as part of looking at income. I've always favored that. I think that there's so many ways you can hide income. So if you're going to look at economic conditions, I think that you do have to look at an income test, an asset test. And I think most agencies are, in fact, beginning to do that. I know we did at the University of California. He's absolutely right, though that doesn't address the question of race. If you're going to go with socioeconomic, yes, there is some correlation often between socioeconomic conditions and income, but one is not a perfect substitute for the other, and I never intended to suggest that it was.
Okay, here's my real question. So given that, so you have the affirmative action as far as race is concerned, you have the socioeconomic. So if you go with the socioeconomic, you're leaving out the racial aspect, so therefore you're leaving out people of color that have parents with high income, so you're leaving them out. And if you go with affirmative action, you're leaving out like poor people that are not of color, right? So both are imperfect and both are trying to achieve equality, so why not have both in place? If you only look at the socioeconomic, that's leaving out a section of society. That's leaving out the black people that have high income. If you only look at affirmative action, you're looking at the white people with low income, you're leaving them out. So if you have both in place, wouldn't it overcome the economics of the situation and the racial differences of the situation? Because if you support the socioeconomic, it's ironic because that leaves out a group just to...
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sure, there are going to be groups left out, but I am not one who believes that we need to be helping those who are high income, whether they are black, white, or whatever. I believe if you have the income, you're going to find a way to get your kid into school. There isn't a college that I know of in America that doesn't want black students. Because of the supply and demand of black students, they're in very, very short supply and very high demand. And that can be proven, by the way. So I don't think that we need to be giving any kind of a preference to a high-income black student.
Mr. Wise, 1 minute to respond.
This is going to be hard in 1 minute. Let me tell you why it's important to still have race-based affirmative action for even upper-income folks. I don't know if you're familiar with the research of Claude Steele out at Stanford in the psych department, but what he has found is that affluent black students with families $70,000 or more in annual income still score lower on average on the SAT than white kids from poor families. Now, it's not because they don't value education. It's not because they're not smart. It's not because they come from quote-unquote broken families. They overwhelmingly don't. What his research has found is that when you're a member of a stigmatized group on the basis of race, you take the test under this cloud of what is called stereotype threat, so that when you're sitting down to take that test, you know that if you bomb it, some smartass is going to say, well, seeing as black people, they just can't, right? Whereas white folks know that if I bomb the SAT, I'll be real honest with you. But I knew that nobody was going to say it's because white people aren't good at math. That's not a common stereotype.
What the research has found is that they've done experiments. You put white and black folk in a room, you give them the same questions in 2 different rooms. In the first room, you tell them the test is going to be graded, and black folks will bomb the test because they're afraid of being evaluated. In the other room, you tell them it's not going to be graded and there's no difference. So if you get rid of race affirmative action, those students of color who underperform in spite of good money will be left out.
Thank you, Mr. Wise. Ma'am.
I have a question for Mr. Connerly. First, your opinion that a principle of being treated equally before the law is, I have 2 questions about it. First, how does socioeconomic affirmative action fit into that? Because that is not equality before the law. Second, in a situation where maybe perhaps it's not written down, in the law that the government is treating people inequally, or I don't know. Okay, but then when it's not maybe in word in the law, it's still there in practice. Shouldn't there be something to address that?
I'm sorry, say it again, the last part of your question.
The last part was that you said that there should be the government treating people equally before the law. And if that is not actually occurring, because it is in practice, and maybe it's not in the law that, the government is going to treat blacks a different way, but it's still there in practice, shouldn't there be something to address that? If the government isn't treating people equal before the law, we can't just pretend like it's not there.
That's right. Okay, the first part, though, you're right. Socioeconomic is treating people differently. But I think that we have accepted as a society the notion that we want to help people who are poor. That's what welfare is all about. So I think that we have a consensus among the population that those who are low income, we will ignore that principle of equal treatment before the law. But when it comes to race, we're very nervous about treating people differently. The court yesterday, Supreme Court, reiterated its view that racial classifications are always suspect, and that they don't want to have people treated differently because of race. That is something that as a country we have fought long and hard about. And we have made exceptions. We carved out exceptions on the basis of income. We are still working on this whole business of whether it's legitimate to carve them out on the basis of race. And generally, the carving has gotten narrower and narrower and narrower.
You wouldn't say that there's just as much discontent over welfare as there is over affirmative action?
I think that there's a consensus among people to help those on the basis of income, people who are in need. I've seen studies that show that you don't have universal support, but people will accept the idea of giving help to those who, quote, need it. And I think that a consensus can be found from those on the right as well as those on the left.
Mr. Wise, thank you.
I find that fascinating. And the reason I find it fascinating is that to believe that is to believe that this country has a really good history of loving poor folk and treating poor folk fairly, either they're white, black, Latino, otherwise. There are a couple problems with the socioeconomic piece that I didn't get to say before. Let me say them now because they respond to the question. The first problem is that if you actually switch to an SES basis, whether it was asset-based or income-based, the problem is very quickly you would have affluent families complaining and screaming and yelling and saying, wait a minute, you're lowering standards. My kid had a better SAT score, and you're punishing him or you're punishing her, and you're lowering standards and you're reducing the quality of our school. And you know that alums at this school would go ballistic. And at a lot of other schools like Berkeley and UCLA, even now we see it. Even now we see across the country need-based aid being reduced in favor of merit-based aid because you've got a lot of folks that frankly don't want to provide full quality four-year educations to folks that can't pay for it themselves. To hell with them. To hell with them. We need more merit scholarships. That's happening in state after state, in school after school. So the idea that we have a consensus around it, if that were true, I'd probably be a lot more supportive of this idea, but the evidence doesn't suggest it. The other problem is that, and actually some of the opponents of affirmative action, not Ward Connerly, but others, have actually said that they believe using socioeconomic status is just a backdoor proxy for race, and that if that happened, they would challenge it in the courts.
And the courts have said, by the way, that if you have a policy that has a racially disparate impact, it can be challenged under the law and found to be illegal. So if you've got folks who would say, well, that's just another way of doing race by other means, because disproportionately the beneficiaries would probably be folks of color, not exclusively, but disproportionately, then they would challenge that. They've already said that they would challenge that. The Center for Individual Rights has said it. The Center for Equal Opportunity has said it. Spokespersons for those groups have said it. And so it's not a solution.
Thank you. Anne.
Thank you for coming. My question is for Mr. Connerly. I was wondering, because I remember there was something, it was like tossed around, about how you feel like if there's still discrimination, then we do need affirmative action. And I was wondering with such situations as the Johns Hopkins University having the lynch skeleton hanging out, or Michael Richards snapping on people in the audience, or I think Matthew Shepard getting beaten up because he's gay, would you then deny that in this era there's still discrimination with those incidents still like happening?
No, there's still discrimination.
Okay. Then my next question would be,
Quickly, next
my
one.
next question would be then, isn't affirmative action to give equality of a condition because there's potential for people who discriminate to be in power? Like, would you deny that that is the purpose of affirmative action?
I'm being the straight man for your questions here. And the answer is, you don't say that because Michael Richards says the word nigger, therefore the University of Pennsylvania is entitled to give preference to all black people. There's no nexus there. There's no nexus there.
No, you're misunderstanding me.
Okay.
I'm saying Michael Richards represents the idea that there's still racism out there, be that just him or be anywhere else. I'm saying then, since we both agree that racism is still out there, that means there's the potential for one of the trustees at the University of Pennsylvania, since we're here, to be racist. The idea behind affirmative action, I'm asking you, would you agree that the idea behind affirmative action is to eliminate the possibility of that discrimination coming in between the trustee selection?
No, I don't agree with that.
Then what would you say it is?
I would say that if there is discrimination at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania has to cure that discrimination and deal and address it itself. But the court has been very clear that you can't justify race preferences, the court's term, as a cure to societal ills. The only basis for using it is the pursuit of diversity. That is the only basis. And whether we like it or not, we have to carve out policies that are consistent with the law and the case law.
Thank you. Mr. Wise.
Mr. Connerly actually misstates the case law. The courts have said for 26 years, if not longer, that affirmative action can be used not only for the sake of diversity, but to remedy direct evidence of discrimination by specific institutions. The problem is, no campus wants to admit that they've done anything wrong. So the University of California doesn't want to admit that its policies regarding admissions prior to their movement on the SAT, which they did recently, were blatantly discriminatory. Neither did Michigan. Michigan didn't want to admit that its admission standards, having very little to do with merit, nonetheless resulted in discrimination. So indeed, if administrations, if institutions were willing to just be honest and admit that the things they have done and continue to do perpetuate inequality, affirmative action, according to the case law, could be used. But very few people want to be honest, and that's the problem. You see, it's very interesting. You're absolutely right. Michael Richards' incident and the campus blackface parties and ghetto parties themselves do not justify affirmative action per se, but they do speak to this larger social reality. And what's most important is not just that there have been 20 to 25 campuses in the last several years that have had blackface parties where white folks think it's the height of good humor to put paint on their face and have ghetto parties, like at the University of Texas School of Law, one of the finest law schools in the United States. These folks got good LSATs, had good grades. They were highly qualified white people, clearly never had any character education either at home or in their undergraduate institutions. And by the way, the ghetto parties are a pretty good indication of how comfortable you are with poor folks and how well that socioeconomic affirmative action would go. We get even more of those. And the University of Texas has done nothing to these students, and almost none of the administrations have, even though those parties create a clearly hostile environment for students of color. That's the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg is obviously much bigger.
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you both for being here today. On the surface, my question is about the Tennessee Senate race.
Who's it directed to, sir?
Either Mr. Wise or Mr. Connerly. I hopefully had both.
I'm from Tennessee. I love it.
As you know, Harold Ford Jr., who is black, ran against Bob Corker, who is white. The Republican National Committee ran an ad, I think it was on the air only for a couple of days before it was pulled. At the conclusion of the ad, there was a white woman saying, "Harold, call me," in reference to Mr. Ford's attendance at Playboy Party. My question to both of you is, do you believe that this ad was racist? And what constitutes racism in today's society? And how will we know when there is no longer racism in our society?
Thank you. Mr. Wise, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think it was subtly veiled, thinly veiled racism. It wasn't the kind of racism, frankly, I think of the Willie Horton ad. It wasn't nearly as blatant as the Jesse Helms ad in 1990, which he used against Harvey Gantt, which exploited racial fears about affirmative action in a highly cynical way. But it certainly played upon, even in the eyes of a lot of Republican folks in Tennessee, played upon certain deeply ingrained stereotypes about black male sexuality. So I think it came right up to the line and stepped over the line, not only of good taste, but of the kind of politics that you want to have. I think we have to be more sensitive simply to the history of the way that black male, white female dynamic has been used to stoke racial fear. So I don't think it was deliberate in the sense that folks sat around and said, let's get Ford, because to be honest with you, Harold Ford Jr. has never been a spokesperson on race issues and civil rights. Here's a guy who basically says, that was my daddy's battle, and the day of the election he shows up in a cafe in Jackson, Tennessee with a Confederate flag on the wall. So this is nobody's racial leftist or liberal or radical. He really didn't need to be race-baited, I guess is the point that I'm making. But it does suggest that people are often very unconscious about, and some may have been quite conscious. I may be cutting them too much slack, I don't know. But I'm willing to say, for the sake of argument, that people can just be that stupid to not understand that history. And when you don't understand that history, not only do you have commercials that are inappropriate, you have policies that are inappropriate. Or you fail to do the policies that you need to do, things like affirmative action. One of the reasons I think affirmative action is so important is that it forces us to confront that history in a way that very few other policies or programs do.
No, I don't think that's racist.
At a deeper level, then, what is racism in today's society? I mean, is it the belief that one race is inherently superior? Is it small things? Because it seems like racism, like everyone has their own definition, but what exactly is it, I'm wondering?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, sir.
I think it's many things. I think it's many things. I think that you can evidence racism either from a mischievous standpoint, you can evidence it in a patronizing sort of way, thinking that the only way you can help people who are, quote, minorities is to somehow view them as a perpetual underdog. There are many things that Mr. Wise says that some could say, gee, that's racist. There are some things that I say, someone could say, gee, that's racist. The intent is not racist. He's not a racist. I'm not a racist. So it's often in the eyes of the beholder. And I think that sometimes we're too sensitive to it. We're too quick to say that's racist. If you watch the rant of Michael Richards, that was racist. I mean, that was clearly racist. But sometimes we're too quick to ascribe racism to something that is stupid, perhaps, but may not be racist in nature.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
My question is for Mr. Wise. And when Mr. Wise said that we shouldn't reward the competitor who started 300 years after the first one started, I thought about the difference between a reward and just needing the product that's produced. That's not very clear, but if you could reward the process or you can reward the product, right? I might work really hard to run 400 meters fast, but Carl Lewis would beat me by sleeping all day. But if we needed someone to win the 400 meters, we would put Carl Lewis in and not me, no matter how hard I worked. And the point is that, so if we need capable leaders, and colleges are producing capable, are the breeding grounds of leaders, we need people who do it well. And if they're white or whatever, then we need good leaders, and black people need good leaders too, even if they're white leaders. So I just wanted to say what about the analogy of rewards. If you could clarify.
Thank you. The problem with the analogy to the Carl Lewis situation is that academic standards are not like the ability to run the 400 meters. That is an objective test of speed, which is objective every single time, whereas the ability to get a certain SAT score, get a certain grade, which is contingent on having access to AP and honors courses and certain instruction, is very much socially contingent in this country and has been on race and class. So if I'm actually an admissions officer, I got to be perfectly frank, if I'm looking at applicants, one of whom had significant advantages because of race and class and got on the old scale that I'm familiar with, a 1350 or 1400 on the 1600 scale of the SAT, and there's someone else who did not have those kinds of advantages, didn't have access to AP and honors, which is the case for a disproportionate number of folks of color around the country, and they got a 1050 or an 1100, I'm going to have to be honest with you, I think there's a very good chance that that student may not only have tried harder in the sense of effort, they might actually be the better student. And there have actually been some studies to suggest that. So for example, at the University of Michigan School of Law, a study found that there was an inverse relationship between LSAT score and future success as an attorney. That is to say that those who had the highest LSAT score didn't earn any more, in fact, often earned less, had less professional satisfaction, less involvement in their community than the folks who scored lower. So I guess what I'm saying is that affirmative action doesn't obviate the ability to get good quality leaders, because the standards that it asks us to reevaluate and to think about critically are not objective standards, the way the ability to run the 400-meter race is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you both for coming. I want to reference a book by Leon Higginbottom, who was a judge of the Third Circuit and who was also associated with Pentagon, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote a book, Shades of Freedom. In it, he covers some of the legacy of racism. And I see some disturbing parallels with Mr. Wise's arguments and some of the racist arguments in the past. Just like in the past, Mr. Wise wants to establish white social superiority. In the past, it was biological superiority. He calls it white privilege. He also wants to establish social black inferiority, disadvantage, as he would call it. And my question is, based on this social racism, as Mr. Wise sits there and he probably racially profiles me as a white male from the suburbs, Penn who knows, based on what he said. How do you see that having an impact on further institutionalizing race into our laws and into our society?
I don't think that speaking to a social reality, which is objectively true, can further racism. In this case, the difference between the old racism that said black people are genetically inferior, or the new racism that says they're culturally inferior, which is also very cachet among people on the right. The difference between that and what I'm saying is I'm not implying inferiority or superiority. I'm simply looking at the objective conditions of where people really are, and it's not arguable. It isn't arguable that white folks have historically and contemporaneously, according to all the data you've heard today, and none of which you provide counter evidence for in your question, suggests that white folks have advantages that are about race, that aren't about better effort, they're not about cultural superiority or genetic superiority. Neither are the disadvantages experienced by folks of color about inferiority. They are about unequal treatment. In other words, I'm not implying anything about someone's essence as a white person, as a black person, as a Latino, or any of that. I'm suggesting that to be black or brown has meant something. That's not arguable. To be white has meant something, and what it has meant has been to either be on the upside or the downside of a system of historic apartheid. I don't see how that possibly further reifies or entrenches racism, because it speaks to the reality and then says we must do something about that. I wish there were another way to do it, but ignoring that reality and acting like it's not there because, oh, we don't want to say white people have privilege because that reifies whiteness. No. White privilege reifies whiteness. Advantage for white people reifies whiteness. Not what I'm suggesting. And Leon Higginbotham would surely agree with me and not your interpretation of
Mr. Wise. Thank you.
The great danger in these kind of exchanges is when some of us who are invested in a position are so quick to drag out statistics and then say that those statistics then represent truth, capital T. You want to speak, or do you want me to respond, sir? I'm sure you can. I'm sure you'd like to. The reality is, though, that nobody has cornered the market on disadvantage. I can show you in all parts of California low-income Vietnamese people who struggle just as hard as anybody else, low-income Chinese. They work just as hard, and they are often the victims of discrimination at almost every UC campus there is. I can show you low-income whites in large numbers who also struggle. The statistics sort of belie these problems. They seem to suggest that groups are by definition privileged or disadvantaged. That's the problem that we have when we start looking at this data and trying to extend it to general policies. We end up making some real harmful decisions on the basis of that data.
Thank you. Sir.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you, gentlemen, for both being here this evening. My question is directed to Mr. Wise. In reference to the analogy of the race issue as a track meet, where one person begins the race several laps behind, I would just like to know your thoughts on how your argument addresses the progress of women in this issue, especially keeping in mind that I heard the other day that women now outnumber men in college campuses across America. So if you could just maybe speak to that effect, the other gentleman too, that'd be great.
Well, it's absolutely true, and this speaks to the reality that affirmative action programs, including those that have been shepherded out in California, Washington, and now to be the case in Michigan, have benefited women, particularly white women, historically, and have led directly to more of that opportunity, both in terms of contracting for state, local, and federal contract dollars, and also for higher education access. We've seen a huge explosion, for example, not big enough, but a big explosion in access for women in business schools, for example, increasingly, though not nearly enough, in engineering programs that several years ago, prior, frankly, to the implementation of affirmative action in higher ed, which didn't happen until about 1972 in any formal way in terms of law. Prior to that, that wasn't happening. So your point is absolutely correct, but I would suggest that a lot of that progress owes not just to the hard work of women as women, though that's certainly been part of it, and it owes not only to the Civil Rights Act outlawing in a formal sense gender-based discrimination, but it also speaks to affirmative action policies, equal credit lending policies, which went beyond formal non-discrimination and affirmative action. If anything, it seems to me that that point that you make, which is very true, if anything, justifies the continuation of affirmative action, because that has been at least in part implicated in the very success about which you speak, and good for that.
I think it's owing more to the change in our culture that a woman's place is no longer, and a long time ago we made that decision as a society, it's no longer in the home, cooking the meal after the husband comes home from work. It's going out and doing whatever she wants to do. When our society made that cultural change, and I think that a lot of that is owed to the women's liberation movement. When that happened, that's when we begin to see women going out and serving their place wherever they wanted to serve it. It wasn't so much to affirmative action. I think that's one of the mistakes. Affirmative action gets a lot of credit that it doesn't deserve. A lot of credit that it just doesn't deserve because of changes that happen in our society. And I think you'll find a lot of women who will argue with the notion that they're the beneficiaries of some sort of preference from anybody to get into college. The year after 209 passed in California, women were 55% of the entering class at the law school. Had nothing to do with affirmative action.
Thank you. Sir.
Hello. This is directed at Mr. Connerly. I just had a question regarding an analogy you used earlier. We said that, to paraphrase, that you did not want your children to get candy from the dentist, that you wanted the dentist to give them tough love, to say it's a tough world, to go to high school, apply yourself, and you will be treated equally. And I was just wondering if you could identify the characters in this analogy. Like, that is to say, is the dentist the white power structure, and is that tough love, police brutality, and being relegated to decrepit public school systems? And the second part of the question was, do you believe that myself as a black student at Penn, having, I guess, obviously applied myself in high school, do you believe that once I leave the corridors of this institution, I'll be treated equally as a result of my hard work?
Thank you.
With regard to the latter, yes, I do. I think you will be. And I hope you believe that. I hope you believe that. I hope you go out into the world believing that you're going to get equal treatment. If you don't find it, I think I and everybody else have an obligation to come to your side. But I hope you go out believing and having confidence not only in yourself, but in society. If you go out thinking that you're not going to get it, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, in my view. Part of success, I think, is your own attitude about not only yourself, but about others. I don't know who the dentist is. I mean, it's a cute analogy that you want to make, but I don't know who the dentist is.
It was actually his analogy. But,
Mr. Wise, please.
you know, I'm sure there are a lot of black mothers who would love to not have to tell their kids about the need to keep their hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel when the police stop them. But it'd be pretty damn stupid not to tell the children of black families that, because you just might find out that the world isn't exactly as lovely and beautiful and as equitable as our dreams would have it to be. Telling people about racism is not setting them up for failure. It's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, to suggest it is to blame those who are victimized by discrimination. And families of color for years in this country have spoken to their children about the reality of the power structure, not so as to cripple their children, but so as to prepare them, because the worst thing that can happen, and in fact the data on this is very, very clear, particularly for students of color in elite selective schools like Penn, that the worst thing that can happen is for those students to come in with the belief that everything is going to be good and equal, and then get hit upside the head with the shocking reality that it isn't exactly as has been advertised, because then you're not prepared for that. That's what body armor is about. That's why it's important to know one's history. And in fact, the performance data at elite schools, there's a book called The Source of the River that was written by Doug Massey and several others. And this particular book, Massey and his colleagues talk about the fact that the students who are most identified with the history and with the knowledge of self and with the knowledge of what it is meant and still means to be black are in fact the students who do best at institutions such as this. They are not crippled by the knowledge of racism, they are strengthened by it. And so this conversation isn't a self-fulfilling prophecy. This conversation is about preparing people for truth and reality.
Thank you, Mr. Wise. Folks, before we go to the next question, I would just say officially we're at the end of our 90-minute period, but because of the interest, I want to get to as many questions as possible. It's all the same to you, the audience. We'll go on with a few more questions.
Yeah.
Please, ma'am.
Good evening, gentlemen. My question is directed to you, Mr. Connerly. I was wondering if you could address a comment you made earlier in the evening where you said that black students are in short supply but in high demand. And I was wondering if you can identify exactly why the black students are in short supply. Secondly, I'm hoping you can talk about the phenomenon of racial profiling and driving while black.
Thank you.
Okay, the first part of your question. Let's take California, for example. The year 1999, the year 2002, out of 18,000 black students graduating from California high school, about 1,000 were UC eligible. That means they were within the top 12.5% of their graduating class, and therefore eligible to go to UC. Coincidentally, out of about 18,000 Asian students, 9,000 were UC eligible. 9,000 compared to 1,000. Out of that 1,000 black students, about a third went to HBCUs. Another third went to Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Duke and Princeton with full scholarships. That means about 300 students, 350 students were eligible and available for all of the other public universities in the nation, the selects that wanted them. That is short supply. I think it starts with our kids not getting out of high school. The dropout rate for black kids is in the 40% range, same for Latinos. It starts there, probably starts sooner, with the kids falling behind from the very first day that they enter the K through 12 system. They're behind. They never catch up. And when we're focusing here on affirmative action for going to school A as opposed to school B, while these kids aren't even starting out in school with an equal chance, the supply is very short, very small supply. And we have to focus on that, it seems to me.
Once again, something that Mr. Connerly says fundamentally undermines the basis of his argument. He says that a very small number of black students, for example, in California were UC eligible. They weren't, in other words, qualified enough to go to Berkeley. But they went to Yale, and they went to Princeton, and they went to Harvard, and they came to Penn, and they got in other words, to some really good schools, every bit as good as the University of California at Berkeley, which suggests that maybe UC eligibility criteria ain't all it's cracked up to be, because these were highly qualified students. So the fact that they weren't eligible didn't mean that they weren't qualified. Maybe we need to be revisiting those qualification standards. The year after 209 passed, 800 black and Latino students were prevented from going to the UC, even though they had 1,200 or better on their SAT, which every study suggests is sufficient to succeed on the old 1600 scale at any college in America. And they had 4.0 or better on the GPA, but it wasn't good enough. Now, he'll tell you, for example, that the Asian students were overwhelmingly qualified. We didn't get into this. I'd be happy to in further questions. Let me just say this. It's also the case, according to data from the University of California, that the median income of Asian families represented at the UC, the students there, their families, the median Asian income there was 3 times the African American and Latino median, which is to say, yes, they had a higher rate of eligibility. They also came from considerably more affluent families. And I just want to say that so we don't get into this trap of saying, why can't they just work hard like the Asian kids? They work every bit as hard as the Asian students. They do not come disproportionately from the same socioeconomic status as the Asian students at Berkeley.
Can you please address the issue of racial profiling as institutional racism, particularly within...
Thank you. 30 seconds each, just quickly.
How do you want us to address it? Happens, it's wrong, what do you want us to address?
Okay, I mean, so basically if you say that racial profiling exists, you're also saying that racism is institutionalized, particularly in the criminal justice system. Do you agree?
I have conceded that there is racism. I have also said, however, that I don't think that that's the justification for giving people as a group any form of preference. The courts don't allow that.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I would just say, look, the evidence of institutionalized racism in the justice system is overwhelming. In this country, for example, the Justice Department reports that black and Latino males are 3 times more likely than white males to have their cars stopped and searched for drugs and other illegal contraband, even though white males are 4 times more likely to actually have the stuff in our cars, right? Which suggests that not only is racial profiling happening in races, it's also pretty stupid-ass law enforcement. And it speaks to a reality of ongoing racial oppression about which the conservative right says nearly nothing. In fact, usually, not saying that Ward Connerly represents this, but usually there is an attempt to rationalize it, to justify it. It can't be rationalized and it can't be justified.
Sir, thank you both for coming. One of the best articles or essays I've ever read on affirmative action was by a philosopher named Thomas Hill. And I might not get this entirely right, but I was wondering, what would you say to a model of affirmative action that says racism sends a message that is an insult? And so affirmative action should send a counter message that says that this is not what we believe America to be, and we want to atone for our past injustices.
Who's it directed to, sir?
Either one.
I'll go first. Yeah.
I mean, I think that that's a perfectly valid philosophical premise for affirmative action, but I would just say, I want us not to focus only on what some philosophers have called the backward-looking argument for affirmative action. I mean, I think that's a real one, okay, trying to remedy the effects of past injustice which continue to plague us today, and the evidence is clear on it. But I think it's also just as important to look at the modern-day racism and ongoing discrimination, a present-day, forward-looking justification, because I don't want us to get into the idea that affirmative action is the same as reparations. I happen to believe in substantive, institutional, collective, and communal reparation, by the way, which is a different debate for a different night. But I would suggest that we have to have both a backward-looking and a forward-looking argument that says that, in fact, if we get rid of affirmative action, it's not just that the past won't be remedied. It's that what goes on tomorrow will not be prevented and will be cemented. So I think it's a good argument being made. I just want us to go beyond the backward-looking argument, realize we're talking about ongoing discrimination today as well as a real phenomenon.
Lots of luck selling it to the courts. It's not going to fly. It's not going to fly.
We're going to take 2 more questions.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Wise. Mr. Wise, my parents were born in this country, and we don't live on land taken from non-whites and given to us by the U.S. government. So my question is, what did I do to deserve you standing up there preaching at me, then I am less of a person because of the color of my skin.
I'm not saying
Please.
Well, it's very pithy. I think you know that's not what I'm saying. Where you live, by the way.
I live in New Jersey.
You don't think New Jersey was jacked from people of color and given to white people? No. You're not to be punished, but you're also not to be rewarded for being able to, in the case of your family, come to this country and reap the benefits of whiteness that have been put in place before you. I'm not speaking about you, I'm speaking about me, okay? So don't take it personally. My great-grandfather came here from Russia in 1910. He certainly had nothing to do with slavery, had nothing to do with the theft of half of Mexico, had nothing to do with killing Indian peoples. He was a Jew, and he was discriminated against, no doubt because of his religion, his culture, his language skills, or lack thereof. But I'll tell you what else. The day he got off the boat in this country, in New York, at Ellis Island, he was able to get jobs from day one that were off limits to black people. In fact, his ability to come into the country at all when he did was contingent on being European, because since the 1880s, we had immigration restrictions on anyone who wasn't European, which stayed in place until 1965, the year my father graduated from high school. So my point is, even if our families come after the crime, we inherit the legacy of the crime, and the inertia continues. It's not about punishing you. It's about saying that you ought not be able to reap the benefits of whiteness, which whether you wanted them or not, I certainly didn't. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather might not have. We got them anyway. That is, as James Baldwin said, the price of the ticket, and it must be paid in full.
You know, it's interesting if you were sitting here and you were watching who's clapping and who's not, and who is rolling their eyes at me and who is not. The way that our society is poisoned by this debate. And we have to find some way to find some common path for agreement. And if we can't find that common path, with the idea that we are not a debtor nation, we're not a creditor nation, and whites aren't all privileged and blacks aren't all disadvantaged, and that there is a fundamental ideal of equal treatment before the law, and try to stay with that ideal, and when we stray from it, to bring people back to it, if we can't do that, then this debate is useless, and all the other debates that go around the country on this issue are useless, because we're so far apart by race that I fear for the nation in our trying to find a reasonable solution to this problem.
Thank you. Thanks. Ann?
Hi, good evening. This question is for Mr. Connerly. Thank you. I just want to know, what efforts have you undertaken to address other preferential treatment practices in society that you agree are unfair? Do you plan to, or have you, or are you pursuing them with the same vigor that you are pursuing affirmative action as just a subject?
I don't pursue anything unless I do it with vigor. I believe that legacy admissions are wrong. I got rid of them at the University of California. I started an effort during the Proposal 2 campaign in Michigan to get rid of legacy admissions there. I am going to devote a lot of energy to the concept that public agencies should not be giving preferences to ancestors of students. It is just fundamentally wrong. So I would hope that Mr. Wise could join me in that effort. We can find some consensus, I would hope, on that point. I'm very interested in trying to help students who are, quote, at risk. I do give a lot of time and money to Kevin Johnson's St. Hope Academy in Sacramento, which is a bunch of students who do not have families. And after school, we bring them to the academy and try to help them, mentor, tutor, and get them ready for college. So I'm in the vineyards working.
Well, this is just my own personal feeling, is that I would hope that one with you who can have so much of an influence and impact on society to just focus your energy maybe on those sorts of preferential treatments and not exactly this one, because it means so much to so many people. I just think even addressing those in the beginning and then maybe coming to this one, maybe help others find common ground. That's my comment.
Thank you. Mr. Wise.
I think your question speaks to a very important point. And
that point is that we have lots of kinds of quote-unquote racial preference. For the sake of argument, I am more than willing to concede that affirmative action efforts, the likes of which Mr. Connerly opposes, are preferential in the sense that they target opportunity to those persons who have been targeted for exclusion. That's sort of the gig. That's grammatically accurate. The problem is those pale in comparison, pun very much intended, to the larger structure of institutional preference, whether it is racial profiling by state agencies, whether it is the discrimination in the private sector and public sector with contracting that I spoke to earlier and about which the data really is uncontested and really does actually mean something, or else statisticians should quit their jobs and stop teaching stats if they don't matter. And it seems to me that if we're focusing on this smaller structure of so-called preference, then we're missing the bigger structure of preference. Now, I need a point of clarification from Mr. Connerly, because I remember when he spoke out against legacy admissions at UC, I also remember that at that time the bulk of the Board of Regents didn't support your effort, and the very time that they had the vote, they didn't vote. Now, they may have since changed, but at the time, they did not vote to get rid of legacy admissions, was my understanding. In spite of your efforts, which I applaud and I think were perfectly valid, I would only say that that's not the only white preference in education. If we're going to give standardized tests to unstandardized students from unstandardized schools who've had unstandardized opportunity, that is a form of white and affluent racial and class preference as well that needs to be
Thank you. May I just respond to Mr.
15 seconds.
I wish you'd stay with the fight on legacy for another 6 months, because you would have seen that I came back at it and prevailed.
Sir, this will be our last question. Please make it very fast and pointed.
All right, thank you. This question is directed toward Mr. Connerly. I believe the second person who came up was a young lady. She asked a two-part question. I don't believe the second part of the question was answered. I believe she asked that when there are injustices in, you said that everyone is privy to equal treatment under the law, but when the government does not treat everyone, in theory, that should be true, but when that does not happen, how do you expect to remedy that without affirmative action? Do you have any other alternatives to the affirmative action path in terms of remedying the injustice which is there, which shouldn't exist in theory but does exist?
If a government agency discriminates against someone and that is proven, then I think that the government agency has a responsibility, courts say, and I believe, to make that person whole. Doesn't mean that the government has a responsibility to make everyone in that class, whatever that class happens to be, the beneficiary of some sort of preference.
But what when that doesn't happen? Like if it's going on, but if that process isn't working out, if those things still exist, and the self-auditing process, I think is what you refer to, like the government investigating.
No, I'm saying that if a person who is seeking a job or a person seeking admission to a college is discriminated against, that person blows the whistle on that. That agency has a responsibility to make that person whole. It does not and cannot make preferences for the whole, for everybody in that class, whatever that class happens to be, race or whatever.
And I guess, in closing, the problem with this formal colorblindness, which is what some call it, is not only that it ignores the ongoing reality of both the past effects of racism and ongoing discrimination, but perhaps the biggest problem of all is that formal colorblindness starts with the assumption, in effect, that unless there is a direct act of discrimination that can be pointed to, there's no injury. But one of the things that I mentioned at the outset, and this is so important in the affirmative action debate, is that the vast majority of opportunities, whether we're talking about jobs, whether we're talking about contracts, whether we're talking about the best educational opportunities, are based on networks, contacts, pre-existing advantages and disadvantages, which means that if I'm the most qualified person, I'm not even going to know, in many cases, that the job's available, that the slot's available, that the contract's available. If I don't know it's available because of race, class, gender, inequity, I can't apply for it. If I don't apply for it, I certainly can't get it. And more to the point, I can't be the victim of direct discrimination And then I can't sue anybody because the standard that's being put forward is you've got to show a direct instance of discrimination. What I'm suggesting is institutionalized racism, which prevents people from even being in the race at all, is what affirmative action was really intended to correct. That's what Reagan said in '74, and he was right. That's what Dr. King was talking about in '63, and he was right. And it's what I'm talking about this evening, and I certainly would like to believe that I'm right. Thank you all for coming out this evening.